Hello, my name is Justin Byrne. I'm going to be talking today about habitat mosaics, especially in BNG, and a bit about how they compare between how habitat mosaics are recorded in UKHab, its hierarchical structure, as secondary codes primarily, and compared to BNG, where these habitats are primary codes, and that changes how we map them for that purpose at least. What are habitat mosaics? There are three types of habitat mosaics in the biodiversity statutory metric. There are what we call the defined mosaics, there are other mosaics, and then there's the suburban mosaic slash, urban broad habitat type is how it's called currently in the current version of the metric. And these three different types of habitats are used for very different purposes, and they have different rules that apply to them in terms of how you map them. But habitat mosaics more broadly is the idea that you might have lots of habitats where we have like a range of constituent habitats that make up a broad habitat definition. So we might have, for example, uh, a like a traditional orchard. That's one of our mosaic habitats that has grasslands in it, but also dense canopy of traditional orchard trees, fruit trees. Or we might have a floodplain wetland mosaic that includes a bit of wetland, grassland, ditches, ponds, pools, things like that. So these habitats often are occur together in a very small spatial scale, or they're habitats which only make sense by considering all of these different things that we would normally classify as their own independent habitats as part of a broader picture. So, for example, wood pasture and parkland, the spatial scale is going to be very different from a vegetated garden in terms of how we look at that. But they're both mosaics because they are things that are made up of multiple parts. So, in the statutory metric, the metric says that we need to record these mosaics, these defined mosaics, these five defined mosaics, as the primary biodiversity habitat type in in the metric. And as we map those things for the metric, we should have a map which shows that these habitats, maybe are over this large area, and not break that down into the smaller parts. Many of these are listed as priority habitat types. So, for example, the traditional orchard, wood pasture and parkland, and floodplain wetland mosaic are all priority habitats in terms of the UK, biodiversity action policy. And so there's data layers that can be useful there in terms of working out where they might be if you're considering mapping them or not. Because when you go to these habitats, you might start seeing them as their component parts, a bit of, say, lowland meadow, a bit of wetland, a bit of whatever. But it may need a bit of a nudge to think, oh yeah, actually, maybe we could consider this as part of a mosaic. And those data layers are very good for that. So, as we've said, these defined mosaics have several habitats as part of their definition, and at baseline, they should be recorded as the primary habitat type rather than the smaller subset areas of the constituent habitats. So, if we are breaking these down into the smaller constituent habitats, that can result in there being a lower biodiversity unit value of that area. Um, but we should break out smaller compartments if they don't meet what's called the primary habitat description. So when we go into UKHab and we look at the habitat definition, it will list what habitats might make up that mosaic. And if it's not part of that mosaic, then you can have a judgment there to go, I don't think that this can be mapped as its own habitat parcel. But everything inside that area that does meet that definition, I think you should really strongly consider mapping it as the mosaic habitat, even if there's been some degradation of that habitat. So, how is this different from what happens in UKHab? In UKHab, these mosaics are secondary codes. So, they're in UKHab, the primary codes apply to the parts of that habitat. The individual constituent parts are mapped. So, if you had a floodplain wetland mosaic, you would map the area of lowland meadow, the ditch, the pond, the area of, say, wetland. You would map all of those different constituents, and then you apply a secondary code to all of them, saying this is a floodplain wetland mosaic, or this is a coastal floodplain grazing marsh, or whatever. And this is really the opposite of how BNG asks us to map these habitats in the provided guidance to the user, the user guide for that metric. So both approaches have value, and we're not here to say that you shouldn't be mapping those areas individually. And I think that we can talk later about why that can be a really good idea sometimes, especially if you've got a different purpose for your mapping. But if your purpose is to map or classify habitats for the BNG metric, or to present, say, a map to a client that corresponds to the metric spreadsheet, or to fill in the metric spreadsheet. And on those occasions, BNG user guide is asking us to map the mosaic as the primary habitat type, and that might mean mapping a much larger area than you would normally expect. Yeah, and at the end of this talk, we're going to be having a Q&A, so please do put any questions about this into the Q&A that's available through Zoom, or if you're watching this later, on the LinkedIn page, and we can get back to you. So, as we said, there are situations where we will want to map those different, components of the mosaic. So, it might be that we we're mapping for a completely different purpose. But for our BNG application, as the defined mosaics must be mapped, but there also are other mosaics that we might consider mapping as well. So it's not just those defined mosaics, and those other mosaics I think is much more judgment call about when you want to use them. Those habitat mosaics can be really any habitats at all. We'll talk about that in a second. And for that, I would recommend mapping those constituent habitats if those areas are large enough. So if you've got a mosaic that is just, say, scrub and grassland that is just very difficult to map, and you want to map it as a mosaic because not a defined mosaic, but another mosaic, then I would think about how, is this meeting a minimum mapping unit that you're setting for yourself? In that case, maybe you want to map it, but otherwise, you can also use those other mosaics. And all of this really comes down to questions of scale in mapping. So when we're choosing how we classify land and map land, we have these different spatial scales at which mapping can occur, or which habitats can be defined. You could say that the different areas of the different parts of a tree are different microbial habitats, or habitats for lichens and things like that. There's multiple habitats that you find on a tree. That's the smallest spatial scale we could think about for a, say, microbial habitat. We get to scales of individuals. We look at the whole tree. That is a habitat scale that we use in BNG mapping to map individual trees. Then we have habitat scales that are like, say, whole habitats. So here we have, in this example of heathland, we have have our individual tree scale. We have a scale that maybe is considering that tree as part of an area of scrub or heathland. You have scales then beyond that, which are mosaic habitats, where we might say, okay, this mix of heathland, scrub, grassland is all really one heathland polygon. Or beyond that, maybe it's part of a wood pasture polygon. Maybe this whole area is in a wood pasture, and all of those constituent habitats, the tree, the heathland, the grassland, the bracken, the scrub, all meet part of the defined characteristics of a wood pasture and parkland. And so we then are thinking about mapping at that much larger scale. And then beyond that, obviously, we have scales that are related to sites, landscapes, and regional scales beyond that. So we have these different spatial scales that we do habitat classification and mapping at. And really, when we think about mosaics, we need to be thinking about shifting up to those higher spatial scales so that we can make appropriate decisions about how to map things for the purpose of BNG. And we need to think about that scale, because whether or not the habitat meets the definition of the mosaic will depend on the spatial scale that you're looking at. So, for example, this land here happens to be on I think Putney Heath, and that is an area of known wood pasture and parkland. The definition of wood pasture and parkland, where there is these variable habitats, especially when there's been modification of those habitats, depends on the presence of ancient and veteran trees. And if we choose to break this up into subcompartments and look at a much smaller scale, then smaller areas of that mosaic might not meet the definition of the mosaic habitat. That's kind of what the definition of a mosaic is. So we need to be looking at it in a much larger spatial scale in order to find all of those bits of evidence that together, identify that land as a mosaic habitat. And you can really see how this works when we look at the habitat condition assessment, say for wood, pasture, and parkland, where what we need in that definition is really lots of different types of habitats, and we'll go into that later, that can only really be identified when you look at very large spatial scales. And this is true at various different scales for various habitats. Obviously, vegetated gardens tend to be much smaller, and we'll go into all of those specific habitat types towards the end. So that's kind of defined mosaics. I've talked a bit about other mosaics, but let's go into a bit more detail. So if you've raised a hand, by the way, please put that in a question in the Q&A, and I'll come back to that because it's not very easy for me to respond to those things as I'm going. But please do put it in the Q&A, and I'll get to it if I can. So the other mosaics are what there are any mosaics that we want to use that are not these 5 defined mosaics in the statutory metric, and we don't. This is not a required habitat type. You don't need to use it. You don't even need to use it as a primary. There's no primary description there. It's really something like we don't need to map all these different components. We might just instead map things as say on our map a mix of say 75% calcareous grassland and 25% scrub or whatever. And then when we're filling in the metric, we can give that say 2 different rows or whatever in the metric itself. Have a look at that. So here, for example, we have a hillside, and on this, there's lots of inland rock and scree, which is the priority habitat. There's bits of bracken, there's bits of upland acid grassland, and even around here, you can see in these pools of water, there are some upland fens. This is quite, we would have to make a decision looking at this about which of these habitats we want to map in detail or not. But some of these habitats, I think, would be very difficult to map in detail because the slope, because it's difficult to get measurements. Maybe these habitats shift around a lot. All of these are good reasons to consider using an other mosaic. So we might record this as a certain percentage inland rock, a certain percentage bracken, a certain percentage upland acid grassland, a certain percentage upland fen. And it's worth noting that when we do that, we lose some detail. So if we then, this site, I think it's unlikely that we're putting a large apartment complex on top of it. But where there are habitats where we are going to be doing development, we may want to add the additional spatial precision of mapping the individual habitats, especially in that area where we're going to be doing development, because then we have a much better understanding of what the impact of that development is going to be on the biodiversity. So I really advise you to use other mosaics when you can, and but to think about where you're using them, especially in the context of developments, and whether you need the additional spatial precision that you would need to have this detail. But it's useful to know that you do have it, and that's the second type of mosaic we have in the statutory metric. And the third type of mosaic that we have is the suburban mosaic. So the suburban mosaic, or I think it's what I think we referred to it before as urban broad development or something like that. I can't remember what they're calling it in the latest version. But this is for use during planning when we don't yet have detailed housing plans available. So the metric suggests that we have this default value mosaic of 70% urban sealed surface, 30% urban vegetated garden as a suggestion for what the likely mix of habitats is going to be when all of the detailed development plans are finished. And that can give you a good idea of what the likely impact on BNG is going to be and what the potential uplift is going to be. If you have a different ratio in mind, if you know that the housing density is going to be lower in the area or higher, you have, like, say, maybe a history with this client or a history of developing land, and you know how big the gardens tend to be in relation to the sealed surfaces of the house and roads, etc., then you can justify changing that ratio to something else. Otherwise, this default value of 70/30 exists. And so those are the three different like mosaic types that exist within the metric for you to use. And as you can see, they have three different purposes. We have the defined mosaics, which are things which have like unique habitats that are habitat complexes made of multiple different habitat types that the metric is asking you to map primarily over the constituent habitats as they would be defined in, say, UKHab, so which is the opposite of what UKHab is asking you to do. Then you have the just general other mosaics, which that's very aligned with what UKHab does, and is very flexible for you to use. And then finally, we have these suburban mosaics, which are just used for planning. So when we are thinking about how we divide up habitat mosaics, these can be quite large areas, and might need to consider lots of different types of like habitats that might be within them, and you might need to go, okay, when this area is getting very large, I don't think that that's an appropriate size of habitat parcel. When do you want to divide it up? And the main things that you want to be thinking about when you're dividing habitat parcels for mosaics are splitting based upon condition. And so you should go, think about what the condition criteria are for that habitat type and go, is the habitat parcel that the two habitat parcels that I want to create by splitting this area, are they each large enough to do a sensible condition assessment on them? Which is the same thing you'd ask, for any normal habitat as well. And to do that, you really need to consider the scale at which that mosaic is mapped. So, say open mosaic on previously developed lands, that can happen in quite small spatial scales over a quarter of a hectare. So, you might well find that you get that variation there. But if you're finding that you have a site where you could look at the whole polygon, the whole mapped parcel, and that meets, say, all the criteria for good condition, but then you're splitting it out, and then suddenly the two separate bits don't have the right components anymore because they're missing, one side is missing the things in parcel B and the other side is missing the things in parcel A, then you're devaluing the condition of those two areas. And so I think that is really artificially lowering the biodiversity unit value of that habitat. So I'd be very considerate and very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Work with real intention when you're splitting out habitat parcels within like adjacent areas of the same mosaic, because you really want to be thinking about if that's going to have an artificial impact on the condition assessment. And finally, some of the habitat parcels can also be irreplaceable. So, for example, wood pasture and parkland can be an ancient wood pasture and parkland where there's that continuity of land cover for hundreds of years or longer. And if you have an area of wood pasture and parkland that is irreplaceable and areas that aren't, that seems like a very good reason to divide those up, because you want to make very clear on your site which parts of it are the irreplaceable habitats. Okay, so that was my general advice about looking at mosaics as a whole. And now I'm going to go talk about each of those defined mosaics in more detail to look at some of the difficulties people have with doing this. I'll come to any questions that are in the Q&A at the end, and thank you very much for people who are asking questions in it. And I think that what I'm saying here, there's still a lot of ambiguity in the metric and in UKHab about how we should be interpreting these values, and I'm going to show that in what I'm talking about. So these are not definitive answers. I don't think there are definitive answers out there. There's still a lot of judgment that is used in mapping habitats, but I think a lot of these things are things that I'd like people to think about and go, where do they fall on either side of this issue? So let's take the first defined mosaic and go into that. That's vegetated gardens. I think a lot of time people don't think about vegetated gardens as mosaic habitats, despite the fact that the metric explicitly defines them as that. So again, the metric is saying, if you have the components of a vegetated garden, you should not map those individual components. You should map the overarching habitat vegetated garden. And the definition of a vegetated garden is something that is principally vegetated, not totally vegetated, it doesn't give a percentage, it doesn't say over 50%, although I think that's my interpretation of it. It's saying principally vegetated, which is a very vague term and gives a lot of leeway. So what it definitely is saying is that there are some non-vegetated areas that are allowed in that mapping, which means that I don't think what the metric is asking for us to produce is a detailed map of someone's garden that includes things like stepping stones and other stuff like that. You know, the spatial scale which we're working at is supposed to be a bit more pulled out. So the definition of vegetated garden includes large areas of grass and flower beds, and that's important to note. So, you know, when we think about people's gardens, you know, they're going to have a lot of different habitats in them. They're going to have bushes, they're going to have flower beds, things like that. We really need to think about, you know, whether those are meeting the definition of other habitat types or whether they all can fall into that broad category of vegetated garden. And I think very many vegetated gardens can be mapped as a single polygon, potentially even going around the side of the house, including the front drive. Um, I think that there is some ambiguity about how to record some water features. You know, I think that a bird bath that's a foot wide, you know, built into the floor, I think that probably isn't mappable. But there is at some point where you think a pond will be large enough in a garden to map, and also swimming pools as well. I think that those things like that, large structures, built structures, it's you know you have to make your own decision about how big those kinds of things need to be mappable features. It's worth noting that in the UKHab version 1, sheds, greenhouses, non-permanent structures, detached garages, polytunnels, and shared amenity areas were all included in the definition of garden. So that would mean that UKHab was saying we don't want you to map sheds, we don't want you to map greenhouses, we don't want you to map garages, detached garages. They are part of the garden. Now that's not in version 2 anymore. And I think that how we can interpret that is not clear to me. But I think that non-built structures like so sheds and such, I think that the metric is quite clear in my mind that those things are fine to include in the definition of garden. But when we move to permanent structures, then I think we're in a very different ballpark. So when we look at say gardens that exist in reality, you know, I'm saying you know these patio areas, these stepping stones, all of that is part of a vegetated garden. That doesn't need to be mapped separately for BNG. It might be mapped separately for other purposes, but not for BNG. Um, you know, a raised pool that's not a permanent feature, probably part of garden. You know, flower beds, probably parts of gardens. And I think we also need to think carefully about whether the bushes that are alongside the edge of a fence count as a hedge. That's another thing to think about a lot when you're mapping gardens. Or are they part of that mosaic habitat? And as we all know, small trees are not recorded in gardens. So a tree has to be a foot wide at diameter at breast height in order to class it to quantify as mappable in a garden. And I think all of that points to a level of detail that BNG is asking for gardens that is really clear in that it's not asking for an onerous survey that is going to be referred to in say 30 years time when the house ownership has changed 2 or 3 times or 4 times. And different owners are coming in and starting to manage their garden differently. I think that's the context that we should be thinking about when we're producing these maps is what are we recording? What level of detail is reasonable over this 30-year management timescale? What is reasonable in terms of an effort for individual landowners? Because even when we might be mapping for a housing developer who's making lots and lots of sites, lots and lots of houses, but those individual gardens will then become the property of families that will then be tied up in this whole process, and we're not entirely sure what that will look like in 30 years' time. So I would just be very careful about mapping in detail. I've seen some maps that go down and are basically, planting designs, and so I think we should, really consider that detail, and where that detail is necessary, where there is habitats of value that should be mapped. Which is really common in gardens. There often are very valuable habitats in gardens, especially large gardens. We can have that detail, but I don't think we want to be aiming for planting designs or an arbor survey in the level of detail that we present to BNG. That detail can be kept and used for other purposes, and you might want to do that, but for BNG, I don't think it's there. So, and again, I'll say again, it's worth noting that there's no flower bed habitat in BNG. Flower beds, and these kinds of decorative features are not something that's considered a detail that we need to map for BNG. So think about what your minimum mapping unit is going to be for a garden, depending on the size of that garden. And I don't think we're looking to produce some kind of artistic rendition of that garden. We're looking to produce a simplified practical thing that we can actually use in this 30-year management period. Okay, so that's gardens. Traditional orchards are another defined mosaic that we use a lot. I think that these ones are much less difficult for people to get their heads around. I think, it's very simple. If there's 5 or more fruit or nut trees in an area, and that was part of a kind of traditional orchard scape, or even in a garden setting, that can qualify for this traditional orchard habitat type. And I think they're very commonly found in gardens of large properties. They can be overgrown or abandoned. So by the time that we are surveying it, maybe this whole area has become scrubbed over. Maybe the trees have grown up to a very large height and their canopies have come together. Maybe the understory has changed, and that's all fine. That doesn't preclude it from being mapped or classified as a traditional orchard. It might be in poor condition, but that primary habitat type should be mapped because it could be restorable to a higher quality traditional orchard through management. But normally we would expect to find grassland underneath this, either another neutral grassland, maybe even a meadow, or a modified grassland. And I guess the important thing to note really is that these trees that are part of the orchard are not mapped or recorded separately. They don't have their own point features, which become area habitats, obviously. Where we come to the non-fruit trees, the non-nut trees that maybe are on the edge of the site, I think there, the guidance is not as clear, but I would suspect that you should map those. But those fruit trees that are on the site, we're not going to be recording that as woodland. We're not going to be mapping them as individual point features. Yes, right. So that was quite straightforward, I think. More complicated are these last 2 defined mosaics that I'll be talking about, which are the floodplain wetland mosaic and coastal floodplain grazing marsh, and then obviously after that wood pasture, which I've saved till the end. So floodplain wetland mosaic and coastal floodplain grazing marsh, we know that this can come in 2 different types. Both the coastal floodplain grazing marsh and the floodplain wetland mosaic can be natural or modified. And I think it's a really interesting decision by the metric to not only combine these two UKHab habitats, but also to then add additional guidance in the user guide on how we should be mapping them. I think this makes a lot of ambiguity in how we map these features, how we consider the inclusions and exclusions that are listed in UKHab for these habitats that are not always completely aligned. So I think how I take this, is that these areas, they might be they're areas in the floodplain or areas that are likely to be flooded by storm events in lowland areas near the sea or around estuaries. They might contain ponds, lowland meadows, grasslands, ditches, wetland habitats. I think it's the coastal floodplain grazing marsh that excludes areas of tall fen species such as reed beds, but that's not necessarily the same for coastal floodplain grazing marsh. And so how we deal with those tall reedy areas around floodplain wetland mosaic, I think is, that is something where professional judgment will come in. But in these heavily, when we're thinking about these natural versus modified ones, I think it's very easy to identify the natural ones if you're looking for it, but more difficult to identify the modified ones. And what the guidance says is that these modified ones, these ditches with say pasture field or now just amenity grassland, these modified grassland areas, they shouldn't be mapped unless they support key biodiversity. And I think the guidance identifies some wetland birds that should have at least a certain number of breeding pairs to classify as the land as this mosaic, or they contain species-rich ditches, which then it lists that criteria that you can look into there. I think where it gets more difficult and where professional judgment comes into it more is where we're seeing all of the occasional wetland indicator species in a grassland surrounded a heavily modified floodplain or coastal floodplain, but it's still this modified grassland, and we need to make that decision. And so there, I would think about it carefully. We do want to record those trees and watercourses separately, but that whole area, if we do think it will qualify as coastal floodplain grazing marsh or floodplain wetland mosaic, we should be mapping that as the whole feature. We're not breaking this up into lots of little features, because the condition assessment for floodplain grazing marsh, for coastal floodplain grazing marsh and floodplain wetland mosaic will require us to think about all of those features together. And maybe we break it up into some compartments, but the spatial scale will be much wider. And it's worth remembering that the metric asks you to look at the priority habitat information when you're making this decision, but also says that that priority habitat data is very hit and miss, and that we should definitely be aiming to expand that data set by mapping more floodplain wetland mosaic, especially. So I would be definitely looking to use this habitat more often. And especially when we get to lowland meadow areas which are regularly flooded and have a flood history, I think then we need to be thinking, you know, is there enough diagnostic features? Are there, do I need to look at the ditches to identify whether there's these a potential for breeding birds or wetland birds, all that kind of decision making we need to be doing more often. So that's something that's definitely thinking about, and it's worth reading the manual for the surveyed evaluation of aquatic plants and vertebrate assemblages, blah blah blah, on grazing marsh and ditch systems that BugLife put out. That guidance on identifying these floodplain habitats is really useful. So I would say be very before you go to site, be very cautious about mapping these areas and that might be potential floodplain. I'd look at the soil data and see if those are classified as floodplain soils. I'd look at the land use history. I'd look at the priority habitat maps. And if you think you're going to a site that may have these things, I would familiarize yourself with this this guidance from BugLife, with the UKHab guidance, and be on the lookout for those habitats just in case when you go to site. Right. The next mosaic we're going to look at is the open mosaic on previously developed land. And this, again, has some really good guidance from BugLife from 2013 about how we map those habitats. And the definition in that handbook, the Open Mosaic Survey Handbook, is slightly different from the UKHab definition. And I think, my preference, I have my own preference on which one I would be using to map. But it's worth knowing that these two things are slightly different, and it's worth reading both to understand where this habitat's come from in terms of its definition history. Most habitats aren't defined originally in UKHab. UKHab is adapting at existing definitions, so we should be thinking about that. There is a size threshold, which I think most people ignore for open mosaic in terms of my experience, the ecology assessments I've seen. And so I would bear that in mind about where you stand on that size threshold, about whether smaller areas of habitat can classify as this mosaic, potentially not. And the main thing we need to have is this history of disturbance, which is very common in the semi-natural landscape of Britain. History of disturbance, and that will produce this bare substrate habitat, which is required for the habitat definition. So that could be loose rubble, it could be bare earth, it could be gravel, it could be rocks, substrates of various different sizes, and those will often form the locations where lichens and mosses can grow around. And then in addition to that bare substrate, we'll need to have these open habitats, any of these different open habitat types. Annuals, open grassland plants, species-rich areas, species-poor areas, classified as different habitats for the purpose of assessing whether or not we've reached a mosaic. Heathland can be part of an open mosaic. Inundation species can. Water pools can be its own habitat. Weeds, tall forbs, lichens, mosses, annuals, etc. So there's lots of different things that can qualify as open mosaic habitats, and it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for those things and familiarizing yourself with the guidance if you're going to a brownfield site. I think that when you've got a site that has maybe been derelict land in the past and moved to open mosaic, it's a very challenging question to work out how it should be defined and whether it ever at what stage it ceases to be open mosaic if it's part of that successional community. We really see two types of open mosaic that form. One are, I guess, these open mosaics that form on, say, ex-clay pits, where you've got a huge amount of material that's been excavated, maybe even with heavy metals in, or mine spoil or whatever, and then heaped up, and the land has been very heavily altered because of it, forming these permanent areas where there's very little growth. Ex-landfill sites are often like this, and those areas are not in a successional changing thing. They're not becoming another habitat. They are kind of stuck at this early successional, highly dynamic phase where you'll have where you're having difficulty for scrub establishing, especially. That's one kind of thing you see, and that's really easy, I think, to identify as open mosaic because the land use history is really clear and the habitats complexes are really clear, normally at a large spatial scale. What's more difficult is the small spatial scale open mosaics you see on ex-brownfield sites that are just, where a house has been demolished. And I think that is really challenging because those habitats left to their own devices will eventually go through succession and turn into a different kind of habitat. And that's where we reach this question about, is it still an open mosaic? Is it a closed mosaic now? Has woodland established? Has dense scrub established? Such that now this isn't an open habitat anymore. It's not. It's not dominated by those open habitats that form part of the habitat description. So although in the handbook, not UKHab, but the Mosaic handbook by BugLife, small areas of sparse scrub are included in the habitat definition and encouraged. When we get into really dense scrub, when we get into really dense woodland, there I think that there's a question about whether we're still using this habitat definition correctly. And it's worth knowing that the Open Mosaic Habitat Draft data layer, published I think by Natural England, has a predict value in it, which is called the priority determination value. I don't know why this was selected, but that's what it is. And in that, it contains the confidence in the aerial assessment of the data. You can also see if there's been a ground visit that has confirmed that habitat type. And these are really valuable when we're assessing our confidence in reaching the definition of open mosaic habitat. So before we go to site, let's look at the open mosaic data layer. Let's see what that predict value is, and let's see if there's been a ground visit to the site by BugLife to confirm that this is open mosaic habitat. And if you've got a site that says this is definitely open mosaic and across the whole extent, and that's been confirmed with a BugLife visit or a different kind of confirmatory visit, that I would say you're going to have difficulty justifying not mapping open mosaic habitat across that area. But if it's just based on aerial imagery, especially when we're seeing things like this in the predict value, which is probably the priority habitat, but some uncertainty of interpretation, that's a good reason to be thinking about how we're going to use that data and whether we're going to be applying this habitat code. There's two things that occur in that confidence value. One is a spatial confidence and one is a classification confidence. So here we see the classification confidence is weak form. It could say definitely is habitat, but it says probably is habitat. And that is mostly down to not really knowing whether the habitats that make up the mosaic are actually present on site, and whether the land use history has just produced, say, derelict land, which is a lower biodiversity value, or whether it's produced an open mosaic habitat. The second thing is that it will sometimes say something that says like some areas are definitely or are probably open mosaic, but the exact extent is unknown. In that situation, I think then you're looking much more to carve up this area into the areas that you think actually meet the habitat description. And that's easier to justify. So I would think about that approach when you're going onto a site that might have open mosaic habitat on it. And I would really strongly consider that vacant and derelict land code if you're just seeing early successional communities that don't form a whole mosaic, or if it doesn't meet the definition of the open mosaic habitat in other ways. If it's gone too far and it's a later successional community, then we're looking at scrub habitats, we're looking at woodland habitats, we're looking at closed habitat types. Yeah. So open mosaic on previously developed land again is difficult, but primarily we're going to be mapping the whole area as this one habitat type if it meets the definition. We're not going to be breaking it up into those subcompartments because in UKHab, in BNG rather than UKHab, it's a primary habitat code, not a secondary habitat code. So finally, we're going to get onto wood pasture and parkland, which is, I think, one of the most challenging ones because the spatial scale which this mosaic operates at are larger than some sites, many sites that we work with. So here, for example, when I'm showing this here, I've marked the wood pasture data layer in these yellow dots, and I've also got things like the National Forestry Inventory up here so we can see. And here, wood pasture and parkland also has a predict value, which is that confidence that we're seeing in whether that habitat is there in that spatial extent. And as we said before, it can be irreplaceable or not. It's worth noting that both, it's really worth reading the JNCC original description of this habitat, which basically you can have lifted and put into their guide. They changed very little of the text from the original JNCC habitat description. So I would read that description because it has more detail than the UKHab, and that is the source definition. Well, maybe not the source definition, but it's closer to the source definition than that. And in that, it's really clear that areas of grassland, sports fields, croplands, pasture, converted land still meet the definition of wood pasture and parkland, so long as there are veteran or ancient trees on site that are of biodiversity or conservation value. And those may not be right in the area that you're looking at or in that habitat parcel. That's a judgment call that you need to make, but you need to understand that the spatial scale of this is much bigger than you would normally expect to see on a habitat. So this area here of, I think, cropland, which is has these small woodland sections in it, individual trees, that's still wood pasture, even though it has cropland on top of it. The cropland is part of the characteristics in the description, so part of the description of this habitat type in modified wood pasture that is restorable to higher quality wood pasture. And if we're mapping this as, say, arable field, forest, clumps of trees, the BNG value of this is going to be much lower. It's going to be much more incentivized to convert this restorable land into a development. So, and because the condition assessment requires all these different habitat types in it, if we're subdividing this land, say, in half here, we're going to get a much lower condition value for the woodland, for the site than if we'd opened it up. So we probably shouldn't be dividing it at small spatial scales. Here's another example of a converted wood pasture, and it's really common for wood pasture and parkland to have golf courses on top of it. Again, that's super common, and most of the habitats on that golf course will just be part of the actual description of the wood pasture habitat type, so long as there are those ancient and veteran trees on site, and normally there are. So, for example, here I've overlaid the Woodland Trust's ancient tree inventory data onto this map, and you can see here there are two ancient trees around this golf course. So this golf course will certainly meet the definition of wood pasture and parkland, and that's a much higher BNG value than the modified grassland and individual trees that otherwise would be mapped. So football pitches, like this football pitch here, which with ancient trees and veteran trees around the side of it, that's wood pasture. You know, that's meets that character, that definition. It might not look very much like a wooded system or a high quality grassland, but football pitches, agricultural fields, pasture, children's playgrounds, and obviously parks can all meet this definition, but it's not meant to include parks that are newly established. These are, if we're talking about the parklands part of this habitat type, we're talking about historic parklands, normally associated with a historic house. But yeah, is that ancient and veteran trees of biodiversity value on site? That is the defining diagnostic characteristics of this. And the Woodland Trust data layer is only has so much information. So you do need to know a bit about the site to make this to reach this classification by doing that field visit. So often we see that this wood pasture and parkland data layer overlaps with other priority habitats, like lowland dry-acid grassland. This is Richmond Common, which I think is, so Richmond Park, which I think is, like, in my mind, I'm a bias because I'm from the area, but the definitive, one of the definitive wood pasture parkland examples. You know, it's an ex-royal park, it's full of deer, it's a transhumanistic, you know, system where you've got a mix, you know, game animals, you've got, you know, commons land, you've got woodland, all this other stuff. So so very often you get it overlapping with lowland dry-acid grassland, lowland mixed deciduous woodland, traditional orchards. Often these are in the wood pasture. The BNG metric asks you to preferentially map the Hope Mosaic habitat. So if you're doing that, you know, the metric is saying map the wood pasture and parkland, and it's very high distinctiveness. There's no habitat that is more valuable to map than wood pasture and parkland. And I think that when we're seeing other mosaics like traditional orchards, maybe you can have a think about that. But for the purposes of BNG, that's how you're being asked to map things. And if you're in any doubt about whether to use the wood pasture and parkland habitat type, you need to think about, are there ancient and veteran trees on site? Now, I think that there are situations where we would want to map the lowland dry-acid grassland here rather than wood pasture, even for BNG. But we need to do that with a lot of intentionality and with really clear justification in the metric about why we're doing that, because the metric has otherwise stated a very clear argument. So it's fine to deviate and break all these rules if you have good justification for doing so, especially if that's to do with how you're going to map in order to improve the site in your development plan. So yeah, and as we said before, the condition of the wood pasture is assessed at a very large scale. So to reach good condition, it's going to have things like trees at different life stages, multiple patches of scrub, multiple patches of trees or woodland, deadwood, and open ground cover, which could include grassland or heathland. And bracken, obviously. So, if you've got a very small compartment, you're trying to divide this up, say, into, say, just this section of woodland, that's not going to be big enough to meet all the condition criteria questions at the spatial scales at which wood pasture and parkland operates. So I really would avoid subdividing your parcels unless you're doing so because the condition really strongly differs. Because the spatial scale of wood pasture and parkland is very broad, and if you start dividing everything up, you're not going to have all of the features that you need to get good condition. And you might end up with two areas of moderate condition rather than one area of good condition. And I think that again, there's no wrong way of doing this, and it depends on site by site, but you need to do this with intentionality and you need to think about your justification for this. So yeah, when we're mapping for other purposes, like maybe we want to do some restoration of some specific habitats or work out the BNG value of certain habitats that are in that mosaic, like maybe we're doing an inventory of the lowland dry acid grassland in London. Those situations, there's loads of great reasons why you would map the individual habitat components of any mosaic. But let's just think about whether that's appropriate for your BNG work and consider that the scale of the habitats, this for example, this wood pasture, it's quite small scale, So the spatial scale which we're dividing things up here is very different from, say, Richmond Park, where we're looking at this huge spatial scale. So think about the scale, think about the land use history, and think about, is there a potential to restore high quality wood pasture in this land by removing the football pitch, by removing the tennis court, by removing changing the land management from an agricultural system to a more natural system. So yeah, those are the things to think about. Right, so before I move to the Q&A, and please do put any more questions in the Q&A that you would like, let's just review kind of what we've gone over today, which is, we have these three different types of habitat mosaics in the statutory metric. We have the defined mosaics, we have the other mosaics, and we have this development plan mosaic for broad urban habitat type. They have very different purposes and they have different rules in terms of how you use them. The defined mosaics especially differ very strongly from how you would map those habitats if you are used to mapping in UKHab. If we are subdividing areas of adjacent mosaic habitat, we're very likely to be impacting the condition score of those areas, and we can very easily get to a situation where we map multiple areas of poor or moderate condition mosaic, which when you look as a whole would have met the criteria for good condition. And so we need to be careful about subdividing mosaics. We definitely have very good very good justifiable situations where we want to map all those compartments, even within certain BNG use cases. But generally within BNG, you want to be mapping those defined mosaics as the primary habitat type in a large polygon or large land parcel. And we have that other mosaic, which we can also use kind of any time, which you can have any habitats you like in it, and you just give the appropriate percentages of that habitat type, and that enters into different rows of the metric. So those are the tools that we've discussed today. I think that before I go into the Q&A, I'd just like to remind everyone that we have a partner program at BNG, at AiDash in our BNGAI program. And you can join it by clicking this link, by going to this link, or by using this QR code, and that will allow you to see jobs related to BNG in your area and apply for those jobs and do a bit of work using the kind of the BNG AI app framework. So please look into that. Right, so the Q&A. I've got a question from Dan, which is, how important do you think historic land use is for orchards? E.g., if a large house with a large garden has 5 fruit trees, but there's no evidence of an orchard from old maps, is that a traditional orchard? I think that that's a great question. I think that traditional orchard is the traditional part of it is more isn't a question that's saying this is historically orchard. It's saying, is it an orchard that is under more traditional, non-intensive management? So I'm less personally, I'm less bothered about the land use history of that orchard, and but I would consider, what the purposes of the mapping, who's the customer, what are you intending to do with that land, and does it make sense in this context to map it as a traditional orchard? For example, I wouldn't map somebody who'd put, just in a regular residential garden, some fruit trees down as a traditional orchard. Like Letchworth Garden City, there's a lot of fruit trees because of the way the town was built. In those gardens, I'm not mapping lots of traditional orchards there, but I would think about doing it in a larger house that maybe is like it's very ostentatious. I think that maybe there's a justification in that to say, what, there's a biodiversity piece here that's worth conserving, and in the context of this site, we do have the ability to do that without massively impacting the landowner. And so really, it's that ongoing discussion. It's tradition, it's ecology, it's what we do. I've got a question from Harry, which is, if he's surveying parcel of land within a wood pasture and parkland, but it's a small red line boundary that only encompasses a section of the grassland within the larger. So basically, if the site is a small part of the wood pasture and parkland, are you justified in extending your assessment to the whole parcel for the condition assessments to give it a chance of achieving good? I think it's a really, really good question. And I think that we do see these kinds of things. I think it's a parallel in the river condition assessment that I will lean on. So to go briefly off topic, in river condition assessments, it does say that if you're in a very small site and your river's larger, you will need to look at areas outside of the site to reach an understanding of the condition of that river. I think a similar principle applies. So I think that you should think about a few things. One is, will looking outside the site make a big impact on the condition assessment of that area? So if you're surrounded by deadwood outside of the site, and inside the site there just doesn't happen to be any of it, then I would be thinking, okay, yeah, like I don't want to, I'm not gonna, that's something I should consider. And the other thing is what management on the site is achievable. If your parcel is really small and it's not, that parcel it's not possible to have a diverse range of habitats on it, but in the wider scheme of things, is contributing to a diverse set of habitats that makes up the whole larger habitat parcel, like I said, the larger wood pasture area, then I would say, yeah, we're thinking about the externality of the site. But if on that site there is the potential to restore, like say we're looking at, say, an open mosaic habitat where the spatial scale is much smaller, and we could do a lot more on that site to bring more spatial diversity in, then I think that's something that we probably would want to think about. So think about the spatial scale of the whole habitat versus the site. Think about whether what's achievable, what's doable, what's useful, what's practical. What can the customer realistically do? Because I don't think BNG is meant to hamper landowners with unreasonable requests and burdens. So that's something that I would think about. Seeing if there's any more questions. We have one question, which is, when's an example of when it's better to map in UKHab rather than the Defimetric? So there's loads of habitats that there's way more detail in UKHab than there is in the Defimetric, and that's a real strength of the hierarchical structure, so the nature of UKHab. So, but when it comes to mosaics specifically, I would say that it really is about when you're mapping for a specific purpose that's to do with, say, the conservation or preservation of a certain habitat type. So again, talking with members of the Royal Parks, there is a big initiative to understand what the lowland dry-acid grassland inventory is for London. So that kind of work, obviously you want to be mapping in a system that will identify those areas and classify them. When you might want to identify where you can manage, say, rhododendron on your site, and that you want to have the detail of where that rhododendron is. And this is not a new problem at all, but I think that's maybe we might probably want to get to a point where we have data that can be shown to customers expressing different things. So you might have an overlay which shows where that whole area of wood pasture and parkland is that's on your statutory metric, even when you're mapping the individual habitats as on your map to show the customer. So that kind of trying to display the information in multiple ways so that you can show. I think the real thing I want to avoid is where we have a map that says a metric which just has one row, wood pasture and parkland, and then a map that has 30 polygons that make up that habitat, and the customer is unable to marry those two things together. So as long as we're showing information to the customer or the end user that is useful, that's really the important thing, and that's where we can start combining different classification approaches. Okay, I hope everyone had a really good time and enjoyed that and found that valuable. Please leave any additional questions or comments in on the LinkedIn page. Please consider signing up or investigating this partner program, which is a really great way of getting of working out what work opportunities there are in your area to do kind of quick bits of BNG work. There'll be another webinar next month, and there's also previous webinars that you can look back at to do with the river condition assessments and blending that with BNG. And there'll be more content coming out soon. Thank you all.